September 1944. Morning mist hangs low over the hedgerows of northern France. The smell of wet earth mixes with exhaust fumes and cordite. Allied columns stretch for miles. Sherman tanks, fuel trucks, ambulances, paused not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel lines and unanswered orders. Far to the east, inside improvised German headquarters, maps are being rolled out on rough wooden tables. Red and blue pencils trace front lines that no longer make sense. The German retreat has been brutal, chaotic, and costly. Yet something unexpected has happened. The Allies have slowed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt studies the situation in silence. Others will later describe this moment not as relief, but as recognition. The enemy, for the first time since Normandy, is hesitating. This pause is not accidental. It is the result of a decision made hundreds of miles away by a calm, methodical American general who carries the weight of an entire coalition on his shoulders. To the world, WWII Eisenhower is the architect of victory. To Germany's surviving generals, he is something more complex. And in this brief stillness between battles, they begin to assess what they believe may be his most dangerous mistake. That assessment cannot be understood without first seeing how the war arrived at this moment. By the time Allied vehicles were stalled on the roads of France in September 1944, Dwight David Eisenhower had already been at war for nearly 3 years without ever firing a shot in anger. His battlefield was not a trench or a cockpit, but a map room. His weapon was coordination. His burden was alliance. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, Eisenhower was still an obscure staff officer. Within months, he was brought to Washington, noticed less for brilliance than for balance. George Marshall saw in him an unusual trait: the ability to work with difficult men without being consumed by them. In a coalition war, that quality mattered more than flair. By 1942, Eisenhower was commanding Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. It was a compromise campaign marked by confusion, divided authority, and early humiliation at Kasserine Pass. German commanders there, Rommel among them, did not yet fear Eisenhower, but they noted something important. He absorbed defeat without panic. He adjusted structures rather than issuing emotional orders. After Kasserine, he removed commanders quietly and tightened control. Those habits followed him into 1943 and the Mediterranean campaigns. Sicily and Italy were grinding, indecisive affairs shaped as much by politics as by terrain. British and American commanders argued constantly. Eisenhower rarely imposed his will through force of personality. Instead, he negotiated. He smoothed, he delayed decisions until consensus was possible. To critics, this looked like weakness. To Marshall, it looked like survival. By December 1943, Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord. His task was unprecedented. He commanded not an army, but a partnership. Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, Poles, and others, each with national pride, separate doctrines, and rival generals. The German High Command, watching from across the Channel, did not yet know Eisenhower's name well, but they understood his position. A single commander chosen precisely because he would not fracture the alliance. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, did not go smoothly. Omaha Beach nearly collapsed. British and Canadian forces were pinned down around Caen for weeks. German defenders, though outnumbered, fought with discipline and local superiority. Yet Eisenhower refused to abandon the plan. He accepted losses. He reinforced rather than reshaped. By late July, Operation Cobra broke the stalemate. American forces burst through German lines near Saint-Lô. The German Seventh Army began to disintegrate. Patton's Third Army surged east and south with breathtaking speed. For a brief moment, the war in the West appeared ready to end. This was the moment German generals would later fixate on, because victory, they believed, was suddenly within Allied reach. And yet, instead of a single decisive thrust, Eisenhower reaffirmed his core strategic belief: the broad front advance. All Allied armies would move forward together, maintaining pressure along the entire line. No single spearhead would be allowed to outrun the others. To Eisenhower, this was not caution. It was control. Logistics were fragile, ports were limited, fuel had to be shared. He feared that a narrow advance risked catastrophic isolation. But from the German side of the line, something else was becoming visible. The Allies, for the first time since D-Day, were choosing balance over speed, and in war, balance can buy an enemy time. That time would soon be measured, counted, and exploited by commanders who knew they were fighting a lost war, but not yet a lost campaign. The world was shifting toward a decisive phase, and inside collapsing German headquarters, senior officers began to study the Allied commander not as a symbol, but as a strategist whose decisions could still shape their fate. To understand how they interpreted that choice, we must now turn to the condition of Germany itself in the summer of 1944. By the summer of 1944, Germany's war was no longer a campaign of expansion. It was a struggle for delay. On paper, the Wehrmacht still fielded hundreds of divisions. In reality, many existed only as names. Veteran formations had been destroyed in Normandy. Replacement units arrived under strength, poorly trained, and short of equipment. Fuel was rationed so tightly that armored units often moved only at night, conserving every liter. Yet, despite these weaknesses, German command had not collapsed. It had hardened. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt remained Commander-in-Chief West, though his authority was increasingly hollow, operational. Control was fractured between OKW, OKH, and Hitler's personal headquarters. Orders contradicted each other. Withdrawal was forbidden even when positions were indefensible. The result was constant improvisation at the front. German generals later wrote that this environment forced them to think defensively in ways they never had before. They could no longer plan sweeping maneuvers. They planned hours, sometimes minutes. After the Allied breakout in late July, German forces were nearly annihilated in the Falaise pocket. Tens of thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment was abandoned in fields and along roadsides, yet the pocket was not sealed completely. Thousands escaped eastward, without heavy weapons but with experience. Those survivors mattered. They formed the skeleton of new defensive lines along the Seine and later the German border. They carried with them a hard-earned understanding of Allied methods: speed, yes, but also method; firepower, but also procedure. As Allied forces advanced toward Paris and beyond, German commanders expected relentless pursuit. That was doctrine. That was logic. Instead, they observed hesitation. Fuel shortages slowed American spearheads. Supply lines stretched back to Normandy beaches, still under enemy artillery range. Eisenhower refused to favor Patton at the expense of Montgomery or vice versa. Requests for concentrated thrusts were denied or postponed. From German headquarters, this was not interpreted as mercy. It was analyzed as structure. General Günther Blumentritt, later Chief of Staff to von Rundstedt, would write that Allied command advanced everywhere but nowhere decisively. Others echoed the same theme. The enemy was powerful but bound by its own system. This system allowed Germany to do something it had not been able to do since June: rebuild coherence. Defensive lines were formed along rivers. Bridges were destroyed methodically. Volksgrenadier divisions were assembled from remnants and reserves. Even the Luftwaffe, nearly absent in Normandy, began limited operations over the Reich. Most importantly, German generals were given time to think. They reviewed Allied behavior. They noticed patterns. Eisenhower delegated operational execution to subordinates, but retained strategic control. He favored security over risk. He avoided decisions that could fracture Allied unity. To German eyes, this was both admirable and exploitable. Field Marshal Walter Model, sent west to stabilize the front, reportedly described the situation bluntly. The Allies had the strength to end the war quickly, but not the willingness to gamble it. This interpretation did not mean German confidence had returned. No serious commander believed Germany could win. But they believed something else. The war could be prolonged, and prolongation meant opportunity, political, military, or psychological. Every week gained allowed new weapons to be fielded, new divisions to be raised, and new plans to be drafted. The Allied pause was not long, but it was long enough for German generals to begin framing one decision as pivotal, not decisive in isolation, but decisive in consequence, a decision they would later discuss, debate, and criticize, quietly, analytically, without hatred. That decision would soon reveal itself through action, and it would be judged not in Allied reports, but in German assessments written after the guns fell silent. To understand those judgments, we must now examine the different angles through which German generals viewed Eisenhower's choice. To German generals accustomed to centralized command, Eisenhower was an anomaly. He did not issue orders like a traditional field marshal. He coordinated, he balanced, he mediated. From their perspective, this made him less dangerous tactically, but more resilient strategically. German commanders, such as Blumentritt and Speidel, noted that Eisenhower rarely overruled his subordinates publicly. Montgomery was allowed his methodical approach in the north. Patton was permitted speed in the south, within limits. Bradley operated as a stabilizing force between them. Eisenhower's authority lay not in direct control, but in structure. Yet this structure imposed friction. German generals observed that Allied tempo was often set by compromise rather than necessity. Requests for decisive exploitation were filtered through political and logistical considerations. Eisenhower's fear was not defeat, it was rupture. A broken alliance would be worse than a slowed advance. From the German viewpoint, this was leadership optimized for durability, not shock. It reduced the chance of catastrophic failure, but also reduced the likelihood of rapid collapse of the enemy. They did not underestimate Eisenhower, but they believed he would always choose the option that preserved unity, even at the cost of momentum. And in late 1944, momentum was everything. That belief shaped how German commanders prepared their defenses, not for a reckless dash to Berlin, but for a measured, predictable advance they could counter. German officers were trained to think in Schwerpunkt, decisive concentration of force. They had used it in Poland, France, and the early stages of Barbarossa. Even in retreat, they evaluated enemy actions through that framework. What they saw in Eisenhower's approach disturbed and reassured them simultaneously. The Allied armies advanced across a wide front, applying pressure everywhere. This prevented German forces from stabilizing completely, but it also meant that no single Allied army achieved overwhelming breakthrough beyond recovery. German staff officers tracked Allied supply dumps, road usage, and fuel distribution. They concluded that Eisenhower was consciously preventing any one commander from outrunning logistics or political approval. From their perspective, this turned Allied superiority into something manageable. It allowed German forces to retreat in stages rather than collapse in waves. Bridges could be blown, rear guards could be formed, counterattacks, limited but sharp, could be planned. German generals did not believe they were winning, but they believed they were surviving longer than expected. That survival hinged on one assumption, that Eisenhower would not abandon the broad front strategy, even when circumstances invited risk. And as the front lines edged closer to Germany's borders, that assumption began to shape German planning at the highest level. Unlike Hitler, German field commanders studied their enemy without ideology. They read Allied communiques, they interrogated prisoners, they compared actions to doctrine. What emerged was a consistent picture. Eisenhower was not impulsive. He did not chase headlines. He absorbed pressure upward, shielding subordinates from coalition politics. He valued coordination over speed. General Hans Speidel later wrote that Eisenhower fought the alliance first, the enemy second. This was not meant as an insult, it was an observation. German commanders believed Eisenhower's greatest strength, his ability to hold the coalition together, was also his greatest constraint. Every major decision required consensus, or at least acquiescence. This meant fewer surprises. For an army fighting with inferior resources, predictability was invaluable. German planning began to reflect this understanding. Defensive lines were prepared not for sudden deep thrusts, but for incremental pressure. Reserves were husbanded. Armor was held back for counterblows rather than thrown away. Eisenhower's decision-making style, as interpreted by his enemies, became part of the battlefield, and it would soon collide with a moment where caution and opportunity stood face to face. That collision leads us to the remaining angles through which German generals judged Eisenhower's choice. German generals, despite fighting for a criminal regime, were not blind to the moral weight of command. In their post-war writings, several reflected on Eisenhower's apparent caution with a mixture of respect and frustration. They understood the fear of catastrophic loss. Eisenhower commanded armies drawn from democratic societies. Casualty figures were reported to parliaments and families. Political consequences followed military decisions closely. German generals, by contrast, had long since lost that restraint. They were ordered to fight regardless of loss, often to destruction. From this perspective, Eisenhower's reluctance to gamble made sense. A narrow thrust toward the Rhine, if cut off, could result in tens of thousands captured or killed. A failure on that scale would not only be a military disaster, it would shake Allied unity and public confidence. Yet German commanders argued that war does not reward moral caution indefinitely. They believed Eisenhower was attempting to fight a clean war with an overwhelming advantage. But advantages, they observed, decay if not exploited. Every delay meant more civilian suffering in occupied Europe, more deaths in the East, more cities reduced to rubble. In their view, restraint had its own moral cost. This was not condemnation, it was calculation. They believed Eisenhower chose the safer path because he could afford it, until suddenly he could not. That moment was approaching. Perhaps the most revealing German perspective was not what Eisenhower did, but what he allowed Germany to do. The Allied pause enabled the reconstruction of command coherence. Units shattered in Normandy were reorganized. New Volksgrenadier divisions, though poorly trained, filled gaps. Panzer formations were pulled back, refueled and rearmed, just enough to matter. German intelligence also benefited. The broad front advance exposed patterns in Allied logistics. Supply routes were predictable. Fuel shortages were chronic. German commanders began to see where pressure could be applied asymmetrically. This thinking culminated in a dangerous idea. If the Allies would not concentrate, perhaps Germany should. Field Marshal Model and others began to consider limited offensive action, not to win the war, but to disrupt Allied momentum and fracture command confidence. They believed Eisenhower's system would struggle to respond to sudden, concentrated shock. That belief would later give birth to a gamble of Germany's own. But before that gamble could be made, Eisenhower would face his own defining choice, a choice that, in German eyes, confirmed every assumption they had made about him. That choice, and its immediate consequences, mark the true turning point of this story. By early September 1944, the Allied advance stood at a crossroads that would define the remainder of the war in Western Europe. Paris had been liberated. Belgian cities were falling with minimal resistance. German forces were in retreat across a front stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. For the first time since 1940, Allied troops were approaching Germany itself. At Eisenhower's headquarters, the problem was not the enemy. It was success. The speed of the breakout from Normandy had exceeded every pre-war estimate. Patton's Third Army had raced across France so quickly that maps became obsolete within days. Fuel depots were emptying faster than they could be replenished. Supply trucks drove non-stop from the beaches of Normandy, a lifeline stretched to breaking. Eisenhower now faced competing demands. Montgomery argued for a single decisive thrust through northern Germany. He wanted priority in supplies to drive across the Rhine, bypass the Siegfried Line, and strike into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Reich. If successful, he believed, the war could end by Christmas. Patton demanded fuel to continue eastward, claiming German resistance in front of him was collapsing. Bradley warned that both advances could not be supported simultaneously. Eisenhower listened, and then he chose. He rejected a single thrust. Instead, he reaffirmed the broad front strategy. Supplies would be shared. Advances would continue along the entire line. No army would be allowed to outrun the others by more than logistics could sustain. This decision was not impulsive. It was consistent with everything Eisenhower believed about coalition warfare. But it was also the moment German generals had been waiting for. From their perspective, the Allies had the enemy reeling and chose containment over collapse. German commanders noted the immediate effects. Allied spearheads paused. Armored units waited for fuel. Infantry dug in where they might have advanced. The tempo changed. Behind German lines, the reaction was swift. Orders went out to hold river lines at all costs. The West Wall, abandoned earlier, was reoccupied. Engineers worked day and night to repair fortifications. Units retreating from France were redirected to form a defensive shield along the German border. Field. Marshal Model reportedly remarked that the enemy had given him breathing space. This breathing space would be used with ruthless efficiency. German commanders did not misread the situation. They knew Allied strength was overwhelming, but they also knew that every day bought allowed Germany to convert chaos into resistance. The decision to avoid concentration meant the Allies would face prepared defenses rather than a routed enemy. In German after-action assessments, this moment marked the end of Allied pursuit and the beginning of Allied siege. And with that shift, the nature of the war changed. What followed would not be a race. It would be a grind. The consequences of this choice would soon become visible, first in the skies over Holland, then in the forests along Germany's western frontier. The first test of Eisenhower's decision came not in Germany, but in the low, waterlogged fields of the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden, launched in mid-September 1944, was an attempt to reconcile caution with opportunity. Eisenhower approved Montgomery's plan to seize a series of bridges by airborne assault, creating a narrow corridor over the Rhine. It was bold, but limited, a compromise between a full single thrust and the broad front advance. German generals immediately recognized its vulnerability. The corridor was thin, the timetable was unforgiving. The assumption of weak German resistance was dangerously optimistic. Intelligence reports warning of armored units near Arnhem were discounted. When the operation began on September 17th, German reaction was faster than expected. SS Panzer divisions, battered but intact, were thrown into the fight. Bridges were blown, roads were blocked. The airborne troops fought with extraordinary courage, but without relief. From the German perspective, Market Garden confirmed their assessment of Eisenhower's leadership. He had authorized a daring operation, but not committed to it fully. Supplies and reinforcements were still being spread along the front. No decisive weight was applied to ensure success. When the operation failed to secure the final bridge at Arnhem, the consequences were immediate. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defenses solidified. Allied losses mounted. German generals later wrote that Arnhem was the moment they knew the war would continue into 1945. The pause after Market Garden was longer and more costly than the pause before it. As autumn turned to winter, the Allied advance slowed against prepared defenses. The Hürtgen forest consumed divisions in grinding combat. Weather grounded air power. Supply shortages persisted. Behind the lines, German commanders prepared their final gamble. The breathing space Eisenhower's decision had created now bore fruit. In December 1944, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a desperate, risky operation that relied on surprise and Allied overconfidence. Surprise was achieved. German generals believed the conditions for such an attack existed only because the Allied advance had been methodical rather than overwhelming. Command structures were stretched. Front lines were extended. Confidence had replaced urgency. Although the offensive ultimately failed, it inflicted severe casualties and delayed Allied operations by weeks. For German commanders, this validated their earlier conclusions. Eisenhower had not lost the war, but he had lost the chance to end it early, and that, in their view, was the fatal decision. The cost of that decision would be measured not only in battles fought, but in months added to the war itself. By January 1945, the Western Front bore little resemblance to the fluid battlefield of the previous summer. The Battle of the Bulge had been contained and reversed, but at immense cost. Entire towns in the Ardennes lay flattened beneath snow and shellfire. American divisions had suffered some of the heaviest casualties of the war. German losses were catastrophic, but they had achieved what their commanders intended: time. For Eisenhower, the aftermath was defined by recalibration. He reasserted centralized control over Allied armies during the crisis, temporarily placing Northern forces under Bradley's command to stabilize the front. The coalition held, but only just. German generals, writing later, would note this moment carefully. They observed that Eisenhower performed best in crisis management, not in exploitation. His calm under pressure restored order, but it did not erase the fact that the pressure existed at all. On the battlefield, the consequences of the delayed advance became visible in numbers. Allied casualties between September 1944 and May 1945 numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Cities that might have been spared were destroyed. Civilians endured another winter of war. German command, meanwhile, was collapsing inward. Hitler's interference became absolute. Rational operational planning gave way to fantasy. Yet even in this environment, German generals remained convinced that the prolongation of the war was not inevitable. It had been enabled. In interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence after the surrender, several senior German officers independently identified the same period as decisive, late August to September 1944. They agreed that Germany was closest to collapse then. not because its armies were destroyed, but because its coherence was. The Allied decision to slow, consolidate, and balance had allowed coherence to be restored. Eisenhower never denied this cost. In private correspondence, he acknowledged that different decisions might have shortened the war, but insisted that the risks were unacceptable. German generals did not dispute the risk. They disputed the conclusion. For them, war was already catastrophe. Risk was inherent, and they believed the enemy's refusal to gamble had extended the suffering on all sides. Yet, even in criticism, their assessments remained measured. They did not call Eisenhower incompetent. They called him cautious. And in their view, caution, at that moment, was decisive. Those judgments would take clearer shape after the war, when former enemies began writing history side by side. In the months following Germany's surrender, former Wehrmacht generals reflected extensively on the Western campaign of 1944-1945. Memoirs, post-war interviews, and intelligence interrogations provide a remarkable consistency. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, combined with his refusal to commit to a single decisive thrust, was seen as both prudent and costly. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had died earlier in the campaign but whose staff records survived, noted that Allied caution allowed German forces to breathe, reorganize, and fortify positions we had no right to hold. His successors, von Rundstedt, Blumentritt, and Model, echoed the sentiment. None claimed the Allies had mismanaged the war. All insisted that the war could have ended months earlier if the Allied command had concentrated its striking power decisively after Normandy. The strategic effect was measurable. Allied armies advanced across France at a slower pace than anticipated. Operations such as Market Garden failed, casualties mounted, particularly in the Hürtgen forest, and later during the push into the Ruhr. Logistical strain became acute, forcing Eisenhower to prioritize coordination over momentum. Historians today note that the broad front approach, while politically necessary to maintain coalition unity, produced exactly the kind of operational pause German generals had hoped for. Yet German perspectives were nuanced. Many officers admired Eisenhower's ability to maintain cohesion among diverse armies under immense pressure. They recognized that his decisions prevented political fracturing that could have jeopardized the war effort entirely. Eisenhower's restraint, they concluded, was deliberate and calculated. It was a strategic choice that reflected a different set of priorities: coalition stability over battlefield opportunism. The psychological effect on German commanders was significant. They had expected a relentless Allied pursuit. Instead, they faced a methodical, predictable advance. This predictability allowed them to reorganize, repair defensive positions, and implement counteroffensive operations such as the Ardennes offensive. Though ultimately unsuccessful, the Battle of the Bulge delayed the Allies and inflicted thousands of casualties, demonstrating the consequences of Eisenhower's cautious strategy. Contemporary historians often frame the episode as an example of strategic prudence in coalition warfare. Eisenhower accepted tactical delays and higher casualties in the short term to secure long-term operational stability. German assessments, preserved in memoirs and interrogation reports, provide a rare insight. The Allies had the capability to end the war more swiftly, but chose cohesion over speed. That decision, as German generals framed it, prolonged the conflict and shaped the operational landscape of late 1944 and early 1945. By the spring of 1945, the war's outcome was inevitable. Yet the judgments of the defeated German High Command underscore an enduring lesson. The cost of caution in war is not always measured in defeat, but in opportunity lost, battles prolonged, and the human toll exacted along the way. From these reflections, we can now turn to the calm, measured closure of history, assessing what this pivotal decision meant for warfare, leadership, and humanity itself. History remembers Eisenhower as the man who led the largest coalition in history to victory. But the German general's critiques remind us that victory is never absolute, never free of consequence. Every choice carries trade-offs. Every pause, every restraint, reshapes the battlefield in ways that are felt by soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike. The decision to advance on a broad front rather than concentrate striking power was not a mistake in the conventional sense. It was a deliberate gamble, one measured not in miles gained, but in alliances preserved, supplies managed, and trust maintained among diverse armies. For Eisenhower, war was as much about human systems as it was about tanks and artillery. He understood that cohesion could be more decisive than audacity. From the German perspective, however, that caution was a fatal opening. It granted them time they otherwise would not have had. It allowed retreating divisions to stabilize, engineers to repair bridges, and commanders to anticipate moves. In their eyes, this was the moment the war could have ended sooner, but did not. This reflection teaches that leadership in war is multidimensional. Courage is not always reckless. Prudence is not always passive. Eisenhower's choice illustrates a paradox. A decision can be strategically sound, ethically responsible, and yet tactically prolong conflict, allowing the enemy to exploit every advantage. And in the quiet aftermath, the battlefield itself tells the story. Cities destroyed, forests scarred, and the lives lost on both sides are reminders that every command has human weight. The German general's judgments, meticulously recorded after the guns fell silent, are not indictments. They are testimony to the complexity of decision-making under pressure, the clash between opportunity and caution, and the enduring consequences of leadership choices. In the end, Eisenhower's fatal decision was not fatal to the Allies. It was fatal only in potential, measured in days gained for the enemy and lives spent in delay. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of all. In war, the line between prudence and peril is never wide, and every choice echoes far beyond the battlefield.